This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Mr. Ed Olsen. Welcome, Ed.
Oh, it's good to be here, Sally. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Well, you know, Ed, we can talk about a lot of things tonight. Your travels through life, how you arrived in this part of the world, and maybe also your views on the media. I mean, because for many years you were the publisher of the Macon Telegraph. Is that correct?
Yes, I was. I was in the news business for about 24 years, and most of that time was spent with the Macon Telegraph.
And it's kind of a family occupation, isn't it? Was your father, was he involved in newspapers in some way?
Yes, my father was general manager of the Detroit Free Press in Michigan, and was on the board of directors for Knight Newspapers, which was owned by John S. and James L. Knight.
Wow, so it's sort of a family trade in many
Yes.
ways. Well, before we get into such a discussion, Ed, one of the things we were just mentioning earlier was we were chatting were your adventures in the FBI. Is that correct? You're formerly in the FBI. How did that happen?
Yes, I was a special agent with the FBI for 3 years in Philadelphia and Boston,
Yes.
Massachusetts.
Yes.
Did my training in Washington. Some of the early or interesting cases that I was in. Two of the top 10 people were Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn.
Wow.
Who are now in Chicago and were good friends of Michelle and Barack Obama. In fact, they live in the same neighborhood in Chicago, right near the University of Chicago campus on the south side.
Wow, that's quite a story. So you were pursued, as I'm just trying to recollect the details of what transpired many years ago, but there was sort of a cadre of...
Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn were involved in the Weather Underground and were involved in several bombings in Washington, D.C. and other areas of the country, and they had a house in Greenwich Village where their bombs were being made, and then one time when they were not there, people making the bombs blew up the entire house.
Well, now, did that alert the FBI? There were something amiss there? Or?
Yes, it did alert them, but so it was interesting. In fact, Bernadine was working in the same law firm with Michelle Obama, but Bernadine Dorn cannot be a member of the Illinois bar because she's a convicted felon.
Well, I'm happy to know that our legal colleagues have some restraint there about you can't enter a court, you can't be an officer for the court with a felony conviction, so I'm pleased to know that.
And one of the things about the media just really downplayed or really never talked about the association between the Obamas and Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, who are married and have 3 children now, even though the first kickoff when Obama was running for the Illinois State Legislature, the first kickoff meeting and fundraiser was in Bill Ayers' home. And but it was really downplayed by the media, who sort of ignored the relationship between the two of them.
Well, Ed, this sounds like a good segue into a discussion about the media. Now, obviously, I know you have views on the subject. We're, I guess, talking tonight in a public forum. There's so many different ways that people communicate with one another, and I think there's at least the thought out there that there's a liberal media bias, and it runs through all of American, interchanges on the subject. Is that true or not, or what are your views on that?
Yeah, the mainstream media, there is definitely a liberal bias because most of the stories are started and run and people read what's in the New York Times. And it used to be that if you read the New York Times and someone was on the front page of the New York Times, that's what led the ABC News, CBS News, NBC News at night. And there was no other media to refute or to add to anything that was said by Walter Cronkite at CBS or the people at NBC or ABC. Now you've got a situation where you've got other media. Talk radio is big, bloggers on the internet are big. There was a story when John Kerry was running against George W. Bush that Dan Rather tried to get away with pointing out some documents that were very unfavorable to George W. And Walter Cronkite would have gotten away with that because there was nobody to refute it. But the bloggers came on and said, wait a minute,
Yes.
that typeface did not exist in those years.
Yes. Well, now
And it turned out to be a false story.
Isn't that what's supposed to happen? The framers of the Constitution, when they when they protected free speech and freedom of the press, I mean, isn't that what our forebearers imagined would happen? And your idea is, well, someone can put an opinion out there, and then it will be corrected by people exercising their constitutional rights for free speech. Is that?
Well, in fact, the real purpose of the First Amendment, when it was first started, was not only free speech, but it was free speech to criticize the people in government. And it carried over from the fact that when they were in England, they could not criticize the government or criticize the king if they wanted to keep their head on. So the idea was, for the First Amendment starting out, was that you could criticize government without penalty.
Yes.
And and now, even now, like in today's New York Times, Maureen Dowd, who's a columnist for him, has told Obama that if the United States Supreme Court overturns the Obamacare or the Health Care Act, that he should just ignore the Supreme Court. And it was just sort of shocking to me, or not shocking, but it was surprising to me that she would pick up or write something like that, which of course will carry over to all the other news media throughout the country.
But isn't that okay? I mean, if somebody wants to, I mean, that opinion seems somewhat extreme, if I could say that. But all right, people have their opinions. There's a lot of nutty, I guess, ideas that pass around. Some are not so nutty. We just have the free interchange. I mean, do you think the power of the New York Times is that great? Is it still that powerful an entity? They still, you think, dominate the American, I guess, news cycle and influence what happens, what people think?
I think yes. I think that what happens in the New York Times is read by somebody who's putting out the paper in Peoria or doing a news story in Kansas City.
Yes.
And what's in the New York Times will play very heavily on the stories that those individuals will put into their newspapers, radio broadcasts, or TV reports.
Well, now, just maybe you could enlighten me in any event. I mean, when you put a newspaper together, how is that done? I mean, you're trying to think, what are we going to put as our headline? What's going to be downplayed? It's going to be on page 7. I mean, what happens? Isn't that one of the things you're sort of talking about is the way that news is arranged for the purview of American citizens. So some stories are the trumpets blare, and others are really so far down the line you don't notice them.
And what happens is there's a group of editors. Sometimes, like at the Telegraph, there were 2.
Yes.
The New York Times had 5.
Yes.
And they decide what stories are going to be on the front page of the newspaper for the next morning.
Yes.
Unfortunately, back in 20 years ago, when the New York Times would figure out what was going to be get the top play, all the networks and the other newspapers would do the same thing. And the other thing is, if they did not want a story to get fair play, it might appear on page B23, thinking that nobody was going to read it back there.
Well,
so a lot of the way the media controls the agenda is not only the stories that they promote and give a lot of play to, but also the stories that they ignore or don't give any credence to.
So that's a rather big deal, isn't it? So I would say just a normal person that picks up their newspaper and they look at the headlines, they imagine that that's the important story of the day, and they don't understand there's a process where news is arranged reflecting the viewpoints of this editorial staff as to what they think is important. I mean, for instance, maybe something is, some other story is of great consequence and it's just not mentioned.
That's right. And it really just, a lot of it has to do with what the editors believe and also what they've read. For instance, the big story the last couple of weeks has been on the shooting of Trayvon Martin down in Florida, who was a black youth, and unfortunately he was shot and killed. It was a terrible situation. The news media ignored that story for 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden, after it got reported the first time, every network, newspaper, and everything in the country has picked up on it. and it's gotten all kind of publicity. Writers have written about it, and it has become a big story after it was publicized in the New York Times and after Al Sharpton really got involved with it. And it still gets play every day in the newspapers, even though it's been a story that's been going on for more than 2 weeks.
Wow. And well, I mean, so when do people that are in the I guess the editorial board, when do they decide, well, that's enough, I'm going to talk about something else? I mean, would you be, let's suppose, I mean, we could pick any story, but one newspaper doesn't report that story or downplays it. I mean, does that have a consequence?
Well, sometimes what will happen is there will be another story that will come along that the news people say, this is more important. They'll start
Yes.
publicizing that or reporting that, coming up with stories, different angles about
Yes.
that item, and then the story that they had been playing just goes by the wayside.
What about, I mean, and you know, I think American citizens want to be informed. They want to understand the world they're in. They have a lot of responsibility about making political decisions for their own lives. In the media, do we get things that are sort of sensational, I guess, stories? Maybe I don't know, something rather boring like the governmental crisis in Italy, that Italy might drop out of the EU. Maybe that's a big deal. That's really important. But then maybe there's some person that a cat was stuck, and I don't know, in a drain pipe. I like cats, but some human interest story with a small cat that was endangered, and that gets front page attention. So the sort of I guess the human interest value of the story trumps the importance of the story. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, there's a lot of human interest story. We had a story 3 weeks ago about a cat up in a tree in Macon that
Yes.
it took about 3 days to get
Yes.
that cat down, and that received but there was a lot of interest in that.
Yes.
Also, star power has a lot to do with it. It's after Tiger Woods and his wife had fight over Thanksgiving where she allegedly hit him with a golf club and
Yes.
stuff. For the next several weeks, we were
Yes.
getting an hourly update of what Tiger Woods was doing.
Yes.
And but you know, when President Obama was running for office, he was not really vetted by the press, who really didn't show much interest in what his past life had been, and yet we knew everything about Tiger Woods. We knew.
Yes.
Almost an hourly
Yes,
update.
yes. Well, now-
so that star power gets in there. The same thing with Lindsay Lohan, who was an actress when she was having her problems and going into rehab, and was charged with allegedly stealing a necklace. I mean, it was just constant in the press because of the star power that goes with that.
Well, I mean, isn't there a marketplace for ideas and stories? I mean, if people want to, I guess, just know all about the Hollywood starlet, I mean, and the news media caters to that desire. I mean, it doesn't sound totally wrong.
No, it's not wrong, but there's so many other outlets where they could get that same information, and that I don't know that it's really newsworthy for the mainstream press to keep talking about it day after day.
Now, what about sophistry in the media? In other words, let's say we had sort of discussion about one of the things that goes on, or maybe media, and you know, there's a conservative media too. I mean, there's a conservative and a liberal. You could make a case on the other side. I'd say, let's see, a person like O'Reilly. I don't know what impact he has, but there are people that have impacts on both sides. And is there some other kind of bias that's inserted, let's say, in news when maybe a villainous person, or at least the reporter may think it's a villainous person, describes the person as, let's say, rotund, and a person that he was like the person, he might say, the clean-featured young prosecutor came forward. If you see what I mean, the subtle ways that words are inserted into news stories that tilt the reader toward a particular viewpoint. Are there some kind of standards that prevent that, or any thoughts about that?
No, that's really a lot of the times the bias of the reporter on how he or she is reporting the story. And yes, those words can be used to sway people's opinion on what they think of the individual just because of the way the media words the story.
Yes. Now, just in discussing, so it's sort of an important.
And the other thing is too, on describing people, because of the liberal bias in the media, if you have a conservative elected official,
Yes.
it's always so it's a conservative Republican or conservative.
Right.
I never in the history of reading any news story did I ever
Yes.
see Ted Kennedy referred to as a liberal.
Yes.
He was never the liberal Ted Kennedy. He was just
Yes.
Ted Kennedy, Democrat, Massachusetts.
Yes. So there's some subtle things that are happening as the way the events of our civilization are publicized. I mean, there's some kind of subtle shading of what's occurring. Are there media outlets of one type or another that one could say they've made a tremendous effort to be neutral and to categorize stories in a way that comports with, the general interest, or is it an impossible thing to do? In other words, is it ever possible to take your bias, whatever the bias is, out of the story?
Well, if the reporter has been taught correctly in journalism school, there are ways that they know that they could report a story evenly. But reporters in general, in the research polls that I've read, I mean, they're just different. They have different views on sex. They have different views on religion. Only 2% of the newsroom people attend church on a regular basis. And there's nothing wrong with that. And then they associate with each other, so they really don't hear any outside views. There's really nothing wrong with that and the difference in their views, as long as they understand that that is not the way the general population thinks. And the views of the general population. And in some cases, they don't realize that. They think that they're very mainstream. For instance, the Washington Post had an article 10 years ago, and I thought was interesting because the reporter was talking about the members of the United States Supreme Court. And there were only two types of members. They were either moderates or conservatives. They did not list one of the justices
Yes.
as being liberal.
Yes. What do you? Yes.
No, that's and that's just one way that they can sway people's values on that by just listing, well, our Supreme Court is either a moderate or conservative, and we don't have any liberals on the court.
Do you think one of the ambitions, maybe this is too rash of a statement, but is one of the ambitions of different media outlets to make money? In other words, they're trying. That's with everything else going on. There's a capitalist motive in all the different media outlets, and do they sometimes just, let's say, I think these days things are fairly polarized. So there might be, let's say, a liberal television network and one that's a conservative network, and they tilt their news to their prospective audience. So, for instance, and we can know what networks we're talking about, but a very, very conservative network, or at least one could use that appellation about it, and one that's liberal, and they just tilt all of their news toward their particular audience with the idea that that audience will get some advertising revenue for them.
I really don't think that the news people think about that in terms of generating revenue. I've never found a news person to change a story, to eliminate a story, to put in a particular story because it was going to have an impact on the revenue of
Yes.
the company. In fact, most of the people who work in the news departments don't even think in
Yes.
terms of revenue and expenses and profit, and that's left up to the publisher and the general manager or the advertising
Yes.
salespeople. And I mean, there were many key advertisers
Yes.
that were generating a lot of revenue for the newspaper, and if the newsroom might take some shots at that advertiser, in some cases, I did not even think it was a legitimate news story.
Yes.
But if it was a legitimate news story, the thought of advertising
Yes.
never came into play.
Yes, yes. Well, now, in looking at the structure of people, I guess, that go to journal, the structure of the American media system and people that are reporters and pundits in this, do you think the rewards for that type of career, there's a liberal tilt toward that? In other words, the people that give Pulitzer prizes or give different kinds of media awards, are they trying neutral? Do they try and just say that's excellent reporting or excellent story, or are they impacted by what you would describe as a liberal bias?
I'm not certain about the people that come up with the prizes and make awards on that. I mean, there have been quite a few, because individual writers really are expressing their own opinions.
Yes.
And whether they're expressing a liberal opinion or a conservative opinion or middle of the road, I mean, that's really up to them. And I think the awards, like Charles Krauthammer is considered to be a conservative, and he's been given several very tough awards.
Yes.
So I don't think that the awards process, because although it's interesting in the news business, especially the newspaper business, it gives out more awards to people than any other business in the country except for the movie industry.
They give a lot of awards.
Oh, the newspapers give all kinds of awards.
Is that in lieu of money? I mean, salary, so
well,
people get some awards.
Actually, reporters don't make a lot of money when they first start out.
Yes.
It's it's not something you go into to become rich.
Yeah, so the idea is it's sort of a public service in a way, isn't it, to pursue that kind of career?
Yes, and in fact, a lot of people who go into the news business, if you think the world is good the way it is and you want to make some money, you'll go out and go into business or go to that way.
Yes.
If you think the world is in a bad shape and you want to go out and change the world, then the best way to do that is to get into the news business.
Yes. Now, if there are lots of different, if people think to themselves, well, this particular, news outlet for whatever, they're tilting things in a particular direction. Okay, that's fine. And another one will tilt in another direction, and I'll just amalgamize the two. Do you think that goes on, or people just, as I take it, one of the things about mainstream media might be, in your opinion, that people are not aware of the subtle biases that are present?
Well, and to some extent, the problem is that the editors who make the decision on what columnists they're going to run, they've got a particular bias, and so they will run certain columnists. You look at the columnists who run on a regular basis in the Telegraph. They do have a pretty good mix, I think. I think there are more people who write on a liberal bias, but I think they do a much better mix than some of the papers. I go down to St. Petersburg, which is my hometown, and read the St. Petersburg Times, and there are just about all the columnists on Sunday who are in there are liberal columnists. They don't even give any other viewpoint because that's how the newspaper has been set up for years. But I think the Telegraph does a very good job in mixing up conservative and liberal columnists.
And then they make an effort to, and many media outlets do that. They try, and at least they seem to. They make some efforts. Now, one of the things that I think, just thinking about, I don't want to sound too sinister here, but the idea there might be some kind of subtle mind control exercised by the media about the way what people think. There's a little scintilla of truth about that in a way. If one looks at the Goebbels, Nazi Germany, what's going on, at least my understanding is what the Nazis were attempting to do is they would have like one particular viewpoint they'd want to put across, one sort of poison pill, and they would put that in the middle of lots of human interest stories, cats that are trapped in trees, what the local football team is doing, 5 or 6 things that were just pretty benign. In the middle of that, there would be a poison pill deliberately put there. Do you think that's deliberately being done? People are talking about football games, and then in the middle they make some kind of comment about some subtle sophistry.
No, I don't think that's the case. You don't have a state-controlled media here. You don't have something like they had in Nazi Germany or over in China or when Pravda was taken over in Russia, where the state would control what was going to be in there and put that in. There are too many different outlets, too many sources of news in the United States to be able to do that. Now, if there's a consensus on something that needs to be done, for instance, when hate crime legislation was being thought about in Congress. A story like Matthew Shepard, who some terrible people grabbed him out in Wyoming and beat him up because he happened to be gay, and then tied him to a fence post overnight, and he died. And in the first month, in the mainstream media in the United States, there were over 1,700 stories about that particular case. When a reverse situation happened in Arkansas at about the same time, and in the first month there were only 48 stories about that. But at that time, Congress was considering the hate crimes legislation, and since most of the members of the media were in favor of hate crimes legislation, that's why they gave the news to the various stories. I think because they wanted to make certain that the hate crimes legislation was passed. Well, so those things do happen, but I don't think in the terms, it's because there seems to be a consensus. It's not something where the state-controlled media, like in these other countries, will just put in that poison pill and every section that comes out. Our newsroom people are too independent to do that.
Now, I think you've touched on a good turn of phrase, Ed, and that is there's no state-controlled media here. And I actually think that most politicians are a little nervous that no matter what influence they have with the media, if they really are in error, somebody is going to point it out. It's just, isn't that true? I mean, it's impossible to really suppress negative opinions about any politician. I mean, it's going, right or left. Aren't those opinions or stories that are going to appear somehow, somewhere? And particularly with the internet and the bloggers. I mean, aren't those stories reaching consciousness?
Yes, they are. And in fact, when our president the other day was talking against the United States Supreme Court about overturning legislation passed by Congress, many news organizations and individuals have come forward and said, wait a minute, since the Constitution was first founded, that's what our U.S. Supreme Court's supposed to do, and they've already overturned 159 pieces of legislation that Congress has passed. So, yes, if they try to put out facts that are incorrect, you will get the media will turn around and say, no, that's not true.
Well, now, Ed, I think I'm going to use this venue just to give the President of the United States a little nip, if he can accept that. I think that was, unless the story in some way was manipulated or something. I mean, I think the executive branch needs to understand we have checks and balances here. And in my opinion, I mean, I can't. Maybe there's some kind of political posturing going on, but we have to expect that we have these checks and balances, and important to preserve that. And the fact that I just said that just now, and I gave the President of the United States a nip, I mean, isn't that an argument that we do have a certain freedom of speech? And I mean, we can say what we want to. And
of course you can say what you want to. And the President, although you expect a higher standard of speech coming from the President of the United States, but yes, the Supreme Court is 1/3 of our government, the President is 1/3, and Congress is 1/3, and that's how it was set up in the Constitution.
And that works pretty well, actually. I mean, one of the things that makes checks and balances work here is freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So if ever that's suppressed, if we can't have a meaningful dialogue, then our whole system of government won't work, will it?
No, it will not.
And do you think things are getting better or worse in that regard as you've journeyed through life?
Well, I think with all of the sources of information that are coming out, that it's actually getting better because you're hearing so many more points of view. You're receiving a lot of news that did not used to be reported by the major networks and the major news stories or newspapers. And so I think the proliferation of information that's available now in various reports on the internet, through the newspapers, through the media, is much greater than it's ever been. And I think that can only be good for our country if it continues that way, and there's no attempt on the part of government to start whittling away at the First Amendment.
Well, Ed, on that note, I think our time is about exhausted, but thank you so much for coming. We'll have to come have you back again, and we'll talk some more about these issues.
All right, I enjoyed it, Dr. And it was very good to see you, Sammy, and I enjoyed our conversation.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Thanks.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.